Hello everybody and welcome back to Celestial Perch. Today I have a new video. This one will be focused more so on factions within Stellaris. Although I already briefly touched on factions in my new player guide part 2, I wanted to dive a bit more into factions since they have changed recently, maybe for players coming back into the game. And we weren't able to actually see any factions since we were still at year 0 or 2200. Now we can actually see, around 167 years into the game, we have 6 factions within this roleplay empire that I created for fun. This is the Kingdom of Camelot. At the time I was watching the Merlin TV series and wanted to just kind of mess around. Now, looking a little bit deeper into the actual faction screen here, we can see that we have all of our factions issues, our leader for each faction. Up here, we'll display what percentage we expect our population to be part of each ethos. So we expect 0% of our pops to embrace xenophobic ethos, whereas 14 of our pops will be expected to embrace the authoritarian ethos. Now, looking at each individual faction, we can see here that there is a name led by a leader with our base approval, which we'll get into later, size, support, the issues, and how much current unity we are receiving from that faction. If you played in the past, this would be influence, but due to recent changes, it is now unity. Now, looking a little bit closer at the alien reform lobby, we can see that there is an approval, currently 79% approval. So, as shown on the screen here, we receive a kind of staggered effect of happiness from faction approval. So the alien reform lobby with 79% approval is giving us 5% happiness. This means that the 328 pops that are currently part of the alien reform lobby receive 5% happiness. This will also increase the amount of unity we gain from it. Currently it still says influence, so I guess that's a bit old, but we receive extra unity the higher the approval within this faction. Next, hovering over size, we can see that this faction is broken up of several pops across different planets within our empire. It will tell us exactly how many pops are within this faction and which planets they're actually on. So for example, if we want to look at a specific planet like Camelot, we can go over to the population screen and we can see that we have different ethos here within Camelot. We can also break down, for example, specific pops. We could click on this human and see that he is part of the One Throne group. So we can see which faction he's a part of, and we can see how much political power he has, as well as his current happiness. If we go back to the faction screen, the One Throne group would be our authoritarian faction, also representing pretty high approval, receiving 10%. Whereas if we go back here, let's click on a different ruler. So, this ruler is part of the Alliance of Faith and Values, with only 61% pop happiness, and we can see here that is partially due to the low faction approval, minus 10%. So if we go back, the Alliance of Faith and Values only has 35% approval, so those 94 pops are receiving minus 10% happiness. Now, pop happiness has several effects on our empire. The first one would be adding points of governing ethics attraction to free pops. So for example, up on the screen here, each point of happiness above 50 will add 1% governing ethics attraction, whereas each point of happiness below 50 will add negative 1% governing ethics attraction. And to remind you that our governing ethics would be authoritarian, xenophile, and militarist. So a pop with very high pop approval or pop happiness will be more likely to fall within our governing ethics and within those factions. Pop happiness also factors into our approval rating. So a higher approval rating, as shown on the screen, above 50%, each point will add 0.6 stability up to 30% at 100% approval rating, and each point below 50% will add minus 1 stability up to negative 50 at 0% approval rating. So each of these pops will greatly affect our stability within planets, as shown here. Now, looking at faction support just represents the kind of like political strength or just the political power of that faction. So even though a faction might have not as many pops in it, so for example the One Throne group only has 89 pops, but represents 16% of the total political power support. This is because pops that are rulers will have more political power than pops that are workers or specialists, and so on. Now, there are several ways to manage our factions within the game and increase the approval rating. The easiest way to do that is to complete their issues. You can hover over a specific issue. So, for example, by allowing for the replacement of organic life with robotic workers, this will displease the Alliance of Faith and Values. And you can see exactly here how much it's being reduced, by 5%. This one by 20%, this one by 5%, and this one by 0%. Some of them don't actually reduce the approval rating, but once you satisfy them, they will increase it. And some of them definitely have negative effects. It just depends on the actual issue. For example, looking back at the Alien Reform Lobby, which this is our Xenophile Ethos faction, we can see here that these issues are not actually affecting our overall pop approval. So currently we have a pop approval of 79%. Now, we do have one here, the oppressive subjugation policy, which is reducing it by 10%. So for example, if I go into our policies, go into our subjugation war terms, we could change this to benevolent vassalage, go back to factions, and as we can see here, the faction approval is now 99%, meaning that these 328 pops now have an additional +5 happiness, which will, as mentioned before, positively benefit our empire. As well, we will receive some extra unity. Now, looking at this, there are other ways to manage our factions. We already gone over the issues, but there's also the Manage Faction button. For example, if we go back to the Alien Reform Lobby, with a 99% approval and 328 pops, we might want to promote this faction. By promoting this faction, we will increase the xenophile ethics attraction within our empire by 100%. So now, more pops each month or each year are likely to swap over to the xenophile faction, which will be good because then they will receive extra happiness and we will also receive extra unity and stability. Now, for a faction that we are not really using, we might want to suppress certain factions. So, the militarist faction, although being one of our governing ethics, only represents about 2% of our population, 22 supporters with an extremely low approval rating of 29%. We could suppress this faction, which will reduce its approval even further, but will also reduce our military ethics attraction. Once we've suppressed a faction, the approval will continue to drop. The faction being suppressed reduces the approval by an additional 50%. This will mean our faction happiness will receive -40 instead of the previous -10, which may seem like quite a bit, but over time, the size of this faction will further decrease, and we no longer receive any unity from it, as we have a 0% approval. Still, it can be useful to suppress certain factions and promote other factions. The last thing to go over would be embracing a faction. Embracing a faction will change your governing ethics. So for example, right now we are authoritarian, xenophile, and militarist. Considering we have really not been using militarist and we've begun suppressing it, it might be a good idea to change to a different ethos. Materialist or pacifist are both possible. So we could start promoting this faction, which will also increase our ethics attraction towards materialist. Now, over time, the support of this faction will slowly rise, and when we have more than 20% support, we can spend 5,000 unity to embrace it, which will also increase the faction approval by 10%, and as shown on the screen here, will change our governing ethics. Now, I've let time move on for a bit, and through some finagling with policies as well as living standards, I've been able to get the Materialist faction up to 20% faction approval, as well as 20% support and 85% faction approval. Now what this means is now we can go in here and embrace the faction. So for example, as we see here, we currently have authoritarian, xenophile, and militarist. When we click this faction, manage it, and embrace, it will now change to materialist, xenophile, and authoritarian. We have now lost militarist in exchange for materialist. Now this should cover it for all the kind of just basic faction information, as well as like a little bit more of a in-depth faction guide. If I've missed anything or gotten anything wrong, please let me know in the comments. I always try to consult with Wikipedia, as well as just like other YouTube content creators for Stellaris, to kind of make sure I'm on the right track, and when I'm releasing this updated information, that it is actually correct. But thank you, and have a blessed day.